Recently, I was giving a talk about the culmination of yoga practice under the larger heading of Kundalini Yoga. At the end of that conversation, a woman came up to me and thanked me and asked if I would provide more background and really kind of put out what I had shared with this group in this workshop that I was leading, because she said there's so much confusion about Kundalini Yoga. And the truth is that she's not wrong. There is a lot of confusion about it. And so I thought we could have an in depth conversation. This indeed is intended to be a long form conversation, a conversation in which we can begin to truly unpack some traditional knowledge and see how and in what ways it can benefit us. And so let's have a conversation about Kundalini Yoga, because indeed there is quite a bit of confusion about it. And there's quite a bit of traditional knowledge about it. And there is no reason that modern yoga practitioners shouldn't actually not only be aware of it, but put these practices to use. Okay, so let's just step back for a second. And at the very beginning of this conversation, we need to make a critical distinction. The critical distinction is that there is and has been for about 40 or 50 years, something in that neighborhood, a brand of practice, a brand, and I'm using that word very deliberately, called Kundalini Yoga. You can look it up in the USPTO index of all of the branded names, trademark names. Kundalini Yoga sits there, and it was developed, and this brand was developed, as I said, more or less around 50 years ago. So that's a brand. And the part of the confusion is that we've kind of mixed up or conflated the idea of Kundalini Yoga, the practice, with this brand that is only about 50 years old. So Kundalini Yoga is actually first described, first mentioned in spiritual texts called the Upanishads, which are some of the original and most important texts on yoga practice. The earliest ones where we find the mention of Kundalini Yoga is actually about 3,000 years old. Now, what we need to understand, and then we continue to see this name and description of Kundalini Yoga through the ages, everything kind of from 3,000 years ago to really when it began to really be expounded upon was in around the 9th to the 14th century in the Common Era. So we have this history of Kundalini Yoga. It will be helpful in this conversation to see and to examine whether or not the Kundalini Yoga that was popularized around 50 years ago draws not only from that name, but does it actually even draw from the wisdom? And I think as we go along, we'll be able to answer that question rather precisely. So, what is Kundalini, first of all? And for that, again, I want to first create a rather large context here so we can really begin to understand what the intent of the practice is, what it's referring to. And so there are some references. And for this, what I'd like to actually do initially is pull from metaphysics, quantum physics, in fact, something of the modern era. So in quantum physics and quantum mechanics, there is this sense that a very small expression of consciousness or energy or Big Bang, only a small amount of it has been made manifest, that there is this massive amount, the great majority of the potential energy of what is described as the Big Bang actually exists in the known universe, the things that our senses can perceive and that more or less science so far has mapped out. There's certainly quite a bit that science hasn't mapped out. It so happens, and I'm overgeneralizing around the idea that we find in quantum mechanics, is that it's about a 25 to 75 split, that about 25% of the universe is known, is manifest, if you will. And On the other hand, about 75% is unmanifest or is unknown, and we cannot access it through scientific instrumentation, although maybe over the next centuries, we will have access to it in a more meaningful way. We're having inklings of it. Now, why this is significant, why I start there, is because this is similar to what we find in some of the ancient scriptures. The Bhagavad Gita, for example, gives this kind of same point of view in which the Lord, if you will, is describing the fact, the idea that only a small amount of his lordship or her lordship or God or goddess or essence, the creator, with only a small amount of the creator has the universe gone into the manifest form, and the rest remains as pure potentiality. So, what that is referring to, the part of the universe that you and I do not necessarily have access to, the other 75% is in fact the beginning of us understanding what Kundalini is. Kundalini, in fact, is this way of describing the unknown. In simplest terms, one of my first teachers actually described an idea that we're going to start to begin to unpack here, which is that he had a teacher whose sole mantra, what he would pose to his students over again and again, this sole inquiry was, are you awake? And in other words, this is this idea that can we move out of the known, move out of what is easily identified through our five senses, our intellect, our conditioning, and access this world of the unknown. Now, in short, then what that would mean is that you and I have access. There is a way to wake up to this other 75%. And to do so in spirit, we could call Kundalini Yoga. The yoga of unlocking our experience of the totality of creation, the totality of our potential. And I would even offer on a practical level that when you experience a breakthrough in your own life, you draw from seemingly a reservoir, a sense of discovery, a sense of potentiality, a possibility that until that moment you really hadn't fully known, you'd never fully awakened to. That was a glimpse of Kundalini. Furthermore, what it's suggesting is it's a shift, a fundamental shift in perspective. Our minds are normally conditioned by this distinction of good and bad, right and wrong, positive and negative, past and future, me and other, subject-object division. And awakening to Kundalini, another way of looking at this idea, is this transformation of our perspective from dualism to non-dualism, from that which separates and distinguishes all things to that which binds all things together, that which is all pervasive, that which is literally beyond language, beyond description. A unified field of awareness, which this is the hard question that modern science has yet to really answer, which is this concept of a singular reality that pervades all things, large, small, visible, and invisible, the hard question of consciousness. However, sages, yogis, and yoginis did cross through it. And by the way, it's not confined to yogis. It's also, you could say, the mind of sages and saints, this capacity to see beyond division. access a realm of pure being, feel this affinity and a state of coherence, which is a oneness with all things, and from it, the possibility of working in almost miraculous ways, ways that defy the known parameters of what you and I assume is natural law. That begins to speak to the wonder and grace that is accessible when we wake up to what is beyond the 25% that can be known and that is made manifest. Okay, so that's the big view. Kundalini. The word has a couple of definitions, and depending on the etymology we lean into, because there is more than one, the idea of kundal means coiled. And the idea of that is it's described as a kind of pressure, something that exists in this potentiality, this state of potentiality, and that yet something is contained, or something is locked, or something is hidden, or something is compressed. So the 75% that is the highest state of awareness, that is pure consciousness, is somehow contained and limited. But to be clear, and this is where the traditional understanding of Kundalini Yoga begins, really where it begins, is the idea that, let's be clear, that it's not Kundalini, or that 75% of reality that's limited and it's not awake. It's that we're not awake to it. We don't have access to it. Our minds are subsumed in life and appearances and finite in our senses. And meanwhile, our senses, I like to point out to people, for instance, we know that dogs hear much better, their sense of smell is multiples of our capacity. We know an eagle sees better than the human being, but here's one thing that I find fascinating, and it's worth just reckoning with this for a minute, and that is that human beings evidently see only 0.03%, 0.03%, so less than 1% of the visible and invisible light spectrum. So there's much more invisible light than visible. And it means that you and I, looking into this universe, imagine being suddenly able to see 99% of reality that I don't normally perceive. Would I have very different conclusions about the world I live in, about me, if I could see atoms pulsing and molecules and neurons firing? If I could see the invisible universe, it's more than likely I would have a very different opinion about this universe, about the world, about myself, about you, about each other, about the relationship to me and nature. If I could go outside and see nature vibrating, alive, with that other 99% plus more than I don't normally see. And in a sense, that becomes the message, not just of sages and saints of the yoga tradition and who practice these methodologies, but also even in those who've had, say, near-death experiences, or perhaps those of us who've had deep crises in our life. Whenever we approach death, we begin to have a different appreciation for what life might be. So, Kundal means coiled. And there's another meaning of the word that we'll get to a little bit later, but here's what I would offer, and that is that yogis in particular began to map out methodology to make this crossing from one quality of experience. And what is that? How would we describe this one quality of experience? I would simply say the state of waking and dreaming and sleeping. And you and I are in this realm of waking and sleeping and dreaming. Your waking life might be wonderful. It might be challenging. Your dreaming might be wonderful. It might be frightening. And of course, we know that sleeping is somewhere in this benign ignorance, or it's kind of a blackout mode where we're completely unaware. It's this kind of negation of consciousness. Well, all of us move through the world like that. And what if somehow we could move beyond waking, dreaming, and deep sleep? And this is what these yogis, particular, and now I'll use the word Tantra, because these theories, this theory of Tantra, this school of Tantra, vast, this is really what informs the Hatha Yoga tradition, using body, breath, mantra, visualization. Some of you aware of the methodology of the chakras and how collectively these tools are used to help us cross beyond this normative perception, this 25%, that whatever it is in our waking, dreaming, and sleep life, most of us are unable to escape its confines. We are shackled to the limitations of our senses and those three states of waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. So the yogis began to map out that phenomenon. Rather than leave it up to chance, they developed a methodology, and that methodology is called Kundalini Yoga, part of this larger school tradition called Tantra. Okay, so now there's something important I want to just go back to, and that is that Kundalini, that 75% is not asleep. We are asleep. So the first misnomer, the first mythology that I want you to take away from this conversation and have a deeper and clearer understanding of, is that we are not, we often hear this terminology, awakening the Kundalini. It's not the Kundalini that needs to be awakened. It's me. It's you. It's the one not perceiving it that needs to be awakened. Is that clear? Kundalini, 75%, however you want to think of it, all of these vast potentials, the experience of pure coherence, of consciousness, of oneness, it's already here. What the work of Kundalini Yoga is waking us up. So let's talk about this strategy, and afterward, then we can come back to the challenge, the quandary I first described, which was, I said, there is a confusion between brand and tradition. So what I'm sharing with you is the tradition. I mentioned that the practice of Kundalini Yoga is described in various scriptures. Here's what I want to share with you. Again, we'll break the mythologies down one by one. And that is that I know of none of them that actually describe the work of Kundalini Yoga at the base of your spine. Now, what is described, let's put it this way, is that there is a concentration of this awake energy, this pure potentiality, this oneness, this pure state of coherence, the state of grace, the vision of the absolute is everywhere. The absolute is everywhere. It's not in one place, but it is, according to these teachings, more collected, more concentrated in some places. And so where that one of those places is at the base of the spine. And to help us understand it, to help our mind comprehend it, we're given, you want to call it a metaphor, that's fine. You want to give it describe it as a model or a depiction, however you want to work with it. I like to think of these things as simply aids in us understanding, but some of them are really, in a way, forgive me, but they're a bit of cartoonish. To think that consciousness is only in one place, only at the base of the spine and nowhere else, that's a little odd. In fact, to help us understand, they draw this very specific image that's outlined in the scriptures again and again and again. Down at the base of the spine is what's called a Shiva lingam. And perhaps if you've studied or been around yogic practice, you've seen a Shiva lingam. It's an emblem, a shape. It's actually very often a stone, specific stone, comes from anyway, it's a shape, and this represents pure consciousness. If you've been to India, you'll find them in many Shiva temples. Center of the temple. It represents Shiva or Rudra. It is pure consciousness, undivided awareness. And as part of this image, down at the base of your spine, again, these models are to help you and help us in our mind wrap our head around these things. So at least it gives us a pathway in. Now, the Shiva lingam is this oval-shaped stone, three-dimensional stone. This is pure consciousness. And then the imagery goes even more specific and in depth. And what we see is depicted a red serpent wrapped 3.5 times around the Shiva lingam. What does that represent? And again, these are symbols, representative. Don't get too caught up in it. Consciousness is everywhere. It is me that's asleep. And what we're provided with is a way of understanding. How do I wake up to what is reality beyond what I can see, hear, taste, touch, smell, think about? The 3.5 coils represent the three, what are called the three gunas. These are the three qualities that pervade the manifest universe. The manifest, the 25% universe, not the 75. What are they? Some of you know. Tamas, darkness. Inertia, ignorance. Rajas, activity, movement. That which has a tendency to lead us either toward greater clarity or greater delusion. And the third coil is clarity, sattva, freedom, revelation. These three things are relative to each other. And as I say, they pervade the relative universe. So I know I'm covering a lot, but that's what this conversation is meant to do. Remember now there's another half coil. And that half coil reminds us that we have the potential to disengage or to unbind ourselves from the relative universe and jettison ourselves to this singular vision that is beyond waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. Now the question is, how? And this is as close to a formula for spiritual awakening as you're likely to find in any tradition. I would argue, having studied a lot, there's very few in the world that actually, in the history of mankind or womankind or personhood, that have ever gone to such depth in understanding the process of awakening, of this crossing from known to the unknown, from realized to recognizing pure potentiality. Okay, so now, what I was saying earlier is that there's no scriptures in my 4 decades of teaching and study and practice that say the awakening is at the base of the spine. I know that's contrary to some modern approaches and even what maybe you learned when you were practicing quote-unquote Kundalini Yoga. You can decide at the end of this conversation whether you were actually practicing traditional Kundalini Yoga. You may have been practicing what was developed about 50 years ago by a leading teacher named Yogi Bhajan at the time. But so let's look at that. Let's look at that principle. It's not at the base of the spine that the work is centered. Instead, what we learn is that the work is at the navel center. Now, here's why. I've said it now several times, and I want to make the point again. Kundalini is not asleep. You are. We each are. And what is this sleepness? What is it that prevents us from awakening to pure potential? To the to the pure state, to that state of recognizing and resting in the absolute. What is it? Well, it'll be helpful to work with the model of the 3 lower chakras. You can stop this recording anytime you want. Digest what I've given you so far. Think and reflect on it. This could be a helpful place to stop and pause part 1 and then begin part 2.